I just want to make some comments on, I guess you can call it, some African Americans or some black people that have this ideology about people in Africa, from Nigeria to Ghana to Ethiopia, you name it. In terms of thinking or experiencing that African people, Nigerians, etc., don't like African Americans. In order to understand certain people that are from Africa, say Nigeria as an example, or Ghana, you have to first be open to friendship. The understanding that I have seen made comments about people from Africa by African Americans are obvious to me that they don't have any relationships with people, let's say, from Ethiopia or Ghana, etc. So therefore, the comments are made by some Black Americans because they lack knowledge of it. They're only going by what they believe they're observing or seeing. And I can go ahead and say, and vice versa. I'm sure there's some people from Ghana that have negative understandings of Black Americans, if you will. There's no question that the transatlantic slave trade has impacted the mindset of many people of African descent in the diaspora, but it was meant to do that. This misconception or misunderstanding that somehow people in Africa on the coast, on the Gold Coast, if you will, of Africa, sold blacks into slavery and somehow they benefited. When in fact you can see today that Africa's resources are still owned by Europeans, but somehow they benefited greatly. I'm not saying that slavery didn't happen and people on the continent of Africa did not take part in it. But you have to understand something. Slavery was in existence all over the world. But the difference is the chattel slavery that the Europeans did to people of African descent was the most brutal. We have some Black Americans that talk about the presence of people or Negroid people or African people or people that look Black American. They were already here before Columbus, pre-Columbus, and that's true. But both can be true at the same time. I think that a lot of us don't recognize our history as people of African descent. We don't understand that we were travelers, we were tradesmen, we were merchants long before European history existed. We had religious practices and beliefs. Now, yeah, in Africa, they do have tribalism. They still have tribalism. But it doesn't stop us from embracing and getting to know a person, let's say from Ethiopia, or a person from Ghana. Knowing them by seeing a person in passing or sitting next to a person at your workstation is not really knowing them. I think if both sides would take the time out to get to know each other, you'd probably learn that we have a lot of things in common in terms of our practices. This pointing the finger and the blame game and trying to blanket people of African descent, or rather people in Africa or coming directly from the motherland as being this or that is highly incorrect. And the irony of it is that you don't see other groups of people that do this. They can be Chinese American, that you'll be hard pressed to find them bashing China and what they're doing. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but you got to definitely dig it up. But for some odd reason, and again, I go back to the North Atlantic slave trade and the ideology that it created amongst people of African descent. For some odd reason, you have a lot of Black Americans, maybe even West Indies, I don't know, Definitely over in the Americas, such as Dominican Republic, that have our African descent, but somehow don't acknowledge their blackness. Some odd reason we have this ideology to think that we're separate of them. And somehow, if we think that we're not from Africa, that we were here before Columbus, and therefore we're not a part of the Negroid race, if you will, or the African race. And it's not true, because both can be true at the same time. We were travelers, we were merchants, we were explorers well before European history ever existed. I needed to repeat that because I think that people don't really understand that. And in addition to that, once the Europeans came to the Americas through exploring, they then started a slave trade. And so chattel slavery is the worst kind of slavery that's ever existed in history. And African Americans and many people of Negroid descent experienced chattel slavery. So no, all of us African American people or people of African descent in the Americas, even in parts of Europe, didn't just get there through chattel slavery. We were there before. But we also arrived through chattel slavery. So both are true at the same time. But this notion that somehow we need to be separated, we need to point the finger, you need to be Pan-Africanism, or you need to believe in, you need to be ADOS, or you need to be whatever, B1, I don't know. And if you're not that, then to embrace African people from the continent, it's not the right thing to do because they sold us into slavery and they benefited, which is obviously not true. You can see that today for your own eyes, is ludicrous. And I don't think that what people aren't seem to understand that have this ideology, those Black Americans, if you will, or other people of African descent in the diaspora don't understand. When you have an ideology that you don't want to learn to embrace people from the continent of Africa and various tribes, when you have that ideology, you don't get a chance to find yourself. You can't somehow separate yourself by saying my tribe of African Americans or Black Americans was here well before Columbus, so therefore my people were not about the slave trade, we're not a part of it. You're still Negroid in race. And I think that one of the things that we share in common, outside of many different other things, is that we have all been oppressed due to the fact that we are of a Negroid race. Negroid, you have Mongoloid, and you have Caucasian. Those are the primary races of people. And we can go into a breakdown, but I'm not here to do all that. I'm here to talk about what we have in common. I have heard here recently, and this is the reason why I'm making this comment, that someone was telling another party that called in that Africa is not your utopia. A lot of African Americans believe Africa is some sort of place to go and they're just going to embrace you and la da 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 da, and you can't get this in Africa and you can't. And I don't know where, again, the ideology comes from the enslavement of our minds. I don't think, and I'm not Pan-African. I don't have that ideology. I'm not ADOS. I'm not B1. I'm not this. I'm not that. I'm just an African-American person that has what I believe to be some common sense. Again, you don't see certain groups of people running around, whether they've ever been to Ireland or wherever, running around beating down the place of origin by which their people come from, not necessarily them themselves or their tribe. You don't do it. You don't see it. But you do see it when it comes to Black Americans. And it's a conditioning of the mind that was set forth intentionally. We do need to know each other. One of the ways that certain nationalities in this country get respect is because they come from a country of respect. China comes to mind. China was once thought of as a third world country. Now they're no longer thought of as a third world country. So Chinese Americans are respected in America. If you look back 30, 40 years ago, that was not necessarily the case. Those Black Americans that think that somehow separating themselves from Africa, and when I say Africa, I'm talking about Nigeria, Ethiopia, Ghana, Congo, wherever, doesn't matter, somewhere on the continent, separating yourself from that and somehow believing that because your tribe of Black Americans came before Columbus, or because Africans may have been involved in the slave trade, somehow I have nothing to do with them. Believing this concept, or believing that because you worked with a person from Nigeria and the way that they looked at you was negative, that somehow that represents all the Nigerians or all the Ethiopians, and it does not. On both sides of the Atlantic, people of African descent, Negroids in race, have to come to an understanding and an acknowledgement that they are one. That does not mean that you don't fight for reparations in America. And it certainly don't mean that you turn around and ask Africa, Ghana, or wherever, because Ghana wasn't even in existence during the North Atlantic slave trade, the government itself. It was British ruled, by the way, by England. You don't ask them for reparations. You focus on where you're at. So West Indies can ask Great Britain, while African Americans can ask America for reparations. That's it. But to bash other countries in Africa to somehow justify your quest for reparations here in America makes no sense whatsoever. And it looks as though there's another agenda, another form of agenda in doing that. I mean, we have to use common sense. So common sense tells you that if Africa, Ghana is respected, then so can African Americans be respected. If Nigeria is not respected, how do you expect African Americans to be respected? And one other thing, the resources that are taken by the Europeans in Nigeria, in Ghana, in Congo, and exploited is a similar practice to the exploitation of African Americans in America, and as well as in the Americas. And we don't have to go down the list of exploitation of African Americans in America. We know what they are, but if you look at both the exploitation of African Americans and the exploitations of resources in various countries in Africa, you see one thing in common. You see the word exploitation. So I'm not understanding what people are not understanding within the Black community, that somehow they want to separate themselves, or somehow they got to make this stand that they're not African, or they're not. No, there's something called a race. The primary three races are Mongoloid, Negroid, and Caucasoid, but not in that order. It's Negroid, Mongoloid, and Caucasoid in that exact order, because Africans were first. Negroids were the first human beings on earth. I could care less whether or not Africa has tribalism, because Europeans have tribalism. You can look to Ireland fighting Great Britain for many, many years for what they perceived to be their freedom. You can look to the Polish community. But one thing Europeans are smart enough to share in common is that they are one. They're Caucasian. We are African, of African descent, regardless of whether or not we were here before Columbus or after Columbus. It doesn't really matter. And this hatred that we seem to exemplify is really done on a magnified level amongst people of African descent, in my opinion, more than you find it in any other community. But the reason I want to point out the Chinese American is because some Chinese American may or may not have ever been to China. because they're born in America. But you're hard pressed to see them put down China. And one of the reasons they have respect, outside of other historical facts that I'm not here to mention, is because China has now risen to a place in the world that China is now a contender of some sorts with other first world countries like America. So in order to have any kind of understanding amongst the diaspora as well as the continent of Africa and its people, you first have to understand that you're one. It does not take away from your fight. It doesn't take away from the things that you need to attend to in order to gain more resources within the places that you are born and raised at, such as America or the West Indies, or in England if you're in the diaspora, or if you're in Nigeria, you still have your own struggles. In Ghana, in the Congo, in Ethiopia, wherever, in the Sudan. It doesn't take away from that. But when we sit here and try to separate ourselves and then point the finger and say, well, in Africa they have tribalism. So what? Europeans have tribalism. There are many different groups of people in Asia. Doesn't mean they all get along, but they're not so hard pressed that they're walking around talking about how we're different. No, an Asian is an Asian, and there are different kinds of Asians. But a European is a European, and there's different Europeans from different regions of Europe. But they're one. So this concept of some African Americans that I'm hearing talk about, or putting down other African Americans that speak highly of Africa, is ludicrous. It's ignorant, and it really demonstrates what the North Atlantic slave trade did to the Negroid people, how it impacted their minds. We are now in a global world where all people can be connected. And as far as African Americans are concerned, we need to learn things from Nigerians, and Nigerians can learn things from us. But the only way that we can learn things from each other is by being open, being ready, not allowing one or two or three or four or five experiences that you had by someone that's from the continent of Africa taint your opinion on the people of Africa when you've not really got into a personal relationship. And I mean that vice versa, because the ignorance that is exemplified openly amongst certain Black Americans about putting down Africa, or African people are not your brother, they don't treat you like this, if they have tribalism, they sold us into slavery, I'm not a Pan-Africanism, I'm a B1, whatever your calling is, I really don't care. But if you don't understand that their primary races, which I believe Europeans definitely do, they've demonstrated it, yet African American people in the diaspora, some of them really have an identity crisis. That's not a surprise, but the identity crisis really comes from going through the slave trade experience and really not understanding that you can have all these things. Two things can be true at one time. You can have tribalism, but that does not make you not a Negroid. Europeans understand that. For the most part, East Asians understand that, but it doesn't mean that they don't have their own issues. But again, I'm just talking about the misconception that somehow African Americans have, that Africans just don't like them. Are you going to run across African people from Ghana or Nigeria that are colonized in? The N word, colonized in? Yes, just like you'll run across African Americans that are the N word. So you got the colonized ends, and then you got the N ends, the N word. Okay? which I know you can say this on YouTube, but I'm just going to refrain from doing such because it's really not that important. You get the point. So we can still have our own differences, but still understand we're one. And that's my comment.